Evelyn Carter always believed that the world had a quiet rhythm to it, a kind of invisible music that only revealed itself when someone chose to slow down long enough to hear it. And for most of her life, she had listened closely, faithfully, carrying the weight of other people's stories with a tenderness that felt both natural and inevitable. Because some people are born with a heart that absorbs everything around them, the joy, the grief, the trembling moments of uncertainty, and Evelyn was one of those hearts that never stopped absorbing, never stopped offering warmth, even when the world gave her cold nights in return, and on the night when her whole life seemed to tilt into a different shape, she found herself walking down a dim hospital corridor with the familiar echo of her own footsteps pulsing in her ears, the overhead lights flickering with that dull, tired hum she had memorized during the years she worked as an ICU nurse. Years where she held hands that were losing their grip on life. Years where she told families that their loved ones were gone or barely hanging on. Years where she quietly prayed in broom closets because she didn't want anyone to see the trembling in her own faith. And even now, years after leaving that job, that same trembling rose inside her chest as she sank into a plastic chair against the cold wall, her breath unsteady, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Because good people, she thought, good people are always the ones who end up sitting alone in places like this, carrying the weight of love that never seems to lighten. And she wondered, in a whisper even she could barely hear, why the people who give the most seem to lose the most. Why the ones who heal others often can't heal themselves. Why the good ones always seem to suffer in ways that feel almost personal, almost targeted, like life was sculpted to test them far more than anyone else. The thought made her chest ache in a way she hadn't felt since the night she held her late husband's hand as he slipped away. The night she sat beside Jonah, who was still a teenager then, his face soaked in silent tears, and she remembered promising him that everything would make sense someday, that goodness mattered, that God saw people, all people, especially the ones who hurt quietly. And back then, those words felt real, felt like something she could build a home on. But now, sitting alone in this corridor, waiting for news she wasn't sure she wanted to hear, those same words felt like fragments of a language she no longer fully understood. Jonah had been her joy, her pride, the bright flicker in her darkest days. But somewhere in the years after his father died, something inside him began to dim. Not in a dramatic way, but slowly, like a candle losing oxygen. And Evelyn, so busy saving the world outside her home, didn't realize until it was too late that her own son was drowning in a quiet kind of sadness that never learned how to speak up. And when he grew older, that sadness hardened into anger, then into distance, until she barely recognized the man he had become. A man who carried his father's eyes but none of his warmth. A man who loved his mother but couldn't say it. A man who blamed her for being strong when he needed her to break with him. And now, after months of barely speaking, after an argument that ended with Jonah saying things he could never take back, she had received a call from one of his friends saying Jonah was in trouble again. Real trouble this time, the kind that doesn't go away with apologies. And the moment she heard the words, she felt something inside her collapse with a slow, trembling inevitability. Because a mother's heart can endure only so many storms before even the bravest parts begin to shake. And she drove to the hospital with her hands cold against the steering wheel, replaying every moment she wished she could rewrite. Every moment she wished she had held him instead of holding strangers. Every moment she had chosen compassion for the world over softness for her own child. And by the time she arrived, her body felt as though it was made of both stone and glass, heavy but fragile, ready to crack at any second. Outside the ER, a security guard gave her a sympathetic nod, the kind people give when they have seen 1,000 versions of the same story. And Evelyn walked past him, feeling the familiar tension in her chest, the faith that once held her steady now flickering like a candle in a storm. Because there is something uniquely cruel about watching someone you love destroy themselves while you stand powerless, unable to lift them the way you have lifted so many others. And all she could think was how unfair it felt, how deeply unfair life could be. Because Jonah was not a bad person. He was a wounded one, a good man burning from the inside. And she wondered again why the good ones, the soft ones, The kind ones always seem to carry the weight of the world until their knees shake. As she sat waiting for a doctor to appear with news, any news, her eyes drifted to the reflection in the dark glass of the vending machine, and she saw a woman who looked older than she remembered. A woman whose eyes carried years of giving without receiving enough back. A woman who looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, and she felt tears rise, but refused to let them fall because she didn't want to break here. Not yet. Not until she knew what Jonah needed. Not until she had done everything she could to pull him back from whatever edge he had stepped anew. And as she sat there, her thoughts drifting in and out like tides, she heard footsteps approaching. Soft ones, gentle ones. And when she looked up, she saw a janitor pushing a cart, humming a hymn she hadn't heard since she was a child. A song about light finding the broken. A song her grandmother used to sing while washing dishes. A song she hadn't thought about in decades. And somehow that tiny moment, that tiny sound, cracked something inside her. Not in a painful way, but in a way that softened the tight grip around her heart, and for the first time that night, she breathed deeply as if the world had reminded her that even in the darkest corners of human suffering, there were still traces of grace scattered in unexpected places. Just then, her phone buzzed softly, and she looked down to see a message from Jonah. Just 6 trembling words. I don't know what to do. And though her heart tightened, she felt something else too. Something like a small, fragile flame rising gently back to life. Evelyn stared at Jonah's message for so long that the light from the screen began to blur. Not because she couldn't read the words, but because those 6 simple syllables carried the weight of every unspoken moment between them. Every time she had reached for him and found only silence. Every time he had needed her, and she had been somewhere else trying to save someone else's child. Thinking she had time, thinking love waited patiently, thinking grief healed on its own. And suddenly she felt something shift inside her. Not a grand revelation or a thunderbolt of clarity, but something quieter. Something like a fragile thread reconnecting after years of strain. And she closed her eyes and whispered a trembling thank you. Not because the situation was fixed, not because Jonah was safe, but because he had reached out, and sometimes that single gesture is enough to pull someone back from the cliff's edge. She rose from the hospital chair with unsteady legs, driven by a new current of resolve, and stepped outside into the cold air, her breath forming small ghosts in the night. And as she walked toward the parking lot, she replayed memories of Jonah growing up, his wide grin when he built his first treehouse, the way he held her hand during his father's funeral, the nights he cried quietly thinking she didn't hear him, and the walls he built after that. Walls she tried to climb but couldn't. Walls she eventually accepted as part of the landscape of their lives. Good people suffer, she thought again, because they love deeply, and love makes every loss feel like a fracture, every mistake feel like a wound, every separation feel like an earthquake. And she realized that her suffering wasn't just pain. It was the proof of her love for a son she could never give up on. Not now, not ever. As she reached her car, a man approached her, middle-aged, worn-looking, the kind of face that had weathered too many storms. And he held out a wallet, her wallet, which she hadn't even noticed she dropped in her rush. And he said nothing poetic, nothing dramatic, just a simple, "You dropped this." But the kindness hit her with unexpected force. A reminder that in a world full of grief and chaos, small mercies still bloom in the cracks. And she felt her throat tighten as she thanked him, her voice softer than she intended. She got into her car and drove toward Jonah's apartment, the city lights streaking past like fading constellations. And with each passing block, she felt the fear inside her wrestle with the hope rising quietly against it. Hope that felt hesitant but alive, like a seed pushing through frozen soil. When she arrived, the building seemed tired, the stairwell dim, and as she climbed the steps, she felt the air grow heavier, as if the entire space held its breath for what was about to happen. And she paused outside Jonah's door, hearing the faint shuffle of movement inside, the kind of restless pacing a person does when they're trying not to fall apart. And she knocked softly, her hand trembling despite her resolve. The door opened slowly, revealing Jonah with messy hair, tired eyes, and a face that had forgotten how to pretend, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other, the air thick with everything they had never said. And Evelyn felt every emotion, fear, longing, regret, love, crash into her all at once. But she didn't break, not this time, because she knew that if she broke now, he would break with her. So she steadied herself and stepped inside, letting the silence wrap around them like an old blanket, frayed but familiar. Jonah sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped together, and he finally whispered, "I don't know what's wrong with me." His voice brittle as worn glass, and Evelyn felt her heart splinter because she had waited years to hear even a piece of his truth. She moved closer, not touching him yet, because some wounds need space before they can bear contact, and she told him in a quiet, steady voice that it was okay not to know, okay to hurt, okay to fall apart, okay to ask for help. And as she spoke, she watched something soften in his eyes, something that had been hardened by loss, grief, and years of feeling unseen. She confessed things she had held inside for too long, that she had failed him in moments when he needed her most, that she had buried her own grief instead of teaching him how to share his, that she had been strong for everyone else while forgetting that strength sometimes means breaking in front of the people you love. And as her words filled the room, Jonah's shoulders shook, not dramatically, not loudly, but subtly, like a small earthquake inside him finally loosening the ground that had been frozen for years. When she finally reached out and placed her hand on his, the touch was hesitant at first, then steady, and in that small, fragile moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that felt like forgiveness trying to find its shape. And as the morning sun began to break through the blinds, a soft beam of light fell across their joined hands, illuminating them as if the universe wanted to mark this moment, not with grandeur, but with the gentlest of blessings. And in that brief beam of golden light, time seemed to stretch, slow, soften, and for the first time in years, the ache inside Evelyn loosened. Not because everything was fixed, not because all suffering vanished, but because she realized that pain had guided them exactly to this fragile doorway of healing. And Jonah, for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to stay in the light with her, breathing with her, breaking with her, and beginning again with her. Evelyn stayed beside Jonah as the morning light slowly drew patterns across the faded floorboards. And for the first time in a long time, she felt no urgency to fix anything, no pressure to offer answers, no need to pretend she understood the mysterious ways suffering twists the heart. Because sometimes the deepest healing comes not from explanations, but from presence, from simply refusing to leave someone in their darkness. And as she watched Jonah breathe, fragile but honest, she realized that this moment, this quiet room, this gentle dawn, held more truth than any sermon she had ever heard, because suffering had not come to punish them or to destroy what was left of their relationship. It had come to expose the cracks where love still lived, where hope still waited, where forgiveness still whispered its invitation. And she let that truth settle into her like warm sunlight after a long winter. Over the next few weeks, life did not magically transform, but it shifted in small, almost imperceptible ways, like the soft turning of seasons you only notice when you pause long enough to feel the air change. And Jonah began to join her at the community clinic where she volunteered, not every day, not without struggle, but enough for her to see the boy he used to be glimmer in the corners of the man he was becoming. And the townspeople who once judged her began to soften too, offering small apologies disguised as casual conversations, shy smiles, or hesitant thank yous. Because even they could sense that something quiet and profound had happened between mother and son, something that gave shape to new beginnings. Pastor Hannah would drop by sometimes carrying her well-worn Bible, but instead of platitudes, she offered presence, sitting beside Evelyn in the sunlit hallway. Both women silent, yet deeply understood. And Dr. Malik, usually emotionless, surprised her one afternoon when he admitted that seeing her care for Jonah reminded him why he became a doctor in the first place. And that confession, simple and sincere, stitched another invisible thread into the growing tapestry of grace surrounding her life. The world didn't stop being hard, but it stopped being cold and suffering, once a storm that battered her from every angle, now felt like a strange kind of teacher. Not cruel, not kind, but honest, forcing her to confront parts of herself she had ignored for years. And as she accepted that truth, she began to walk through her days with a steadier breath, a quieter resilience, a gentler faith. One morning, weeks after their reconciliation, Evelyn found herself once again in the same hospital corridor where everything had fallen apart. But this time, the light filtering through the high windows was soft and golden, not harsh and cold. And instead of the trembling fear she felt before, she felt a deep, anchored peace rise slowly inside her, as if the universe exhaled with her. She sat in the same plastic chair, the same worn seat where she once questioned everything she believed, and closed her eyes as a faint hymn drifted from a distant radio. The same hymn she heard the janitor hum that night. Except now it carried a different weight, a gentler promise, as though the melody itself had watched her journey and was welcoming her back. Jonah walked up beside her, his footsteps heavier but grounded, his presence no longer distant but steady. And he placed a warm cup of coffee in her hands without saying a word, a gesture so simple yet so overwhelmingly tender that tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Not from sorrow this time, but from the quiet awe of knowing she was no longer carrying her story alone. They didn't talk about suffering, didn't try to interpret it or wrap it in meaning, because they had learned something deeper, that not all pain requires an answer. Sometimes it only asks for companionship, honesty, and the willingness to face life without turning away. As they walked out into the bright morning air, Evelyn felt the world expand around them, full of imperfections and unexpected beauty. And she finally understood that good people do not suffer because they are forgotten or weak or cursed, but because love opens the heart wide enough for both joy and sorrow to enter. And the same heart that breaks is also the heart that heals, grows, and teaches others how to rise. And with that truth settling gently in her chest, she looked toward the sky, breathed deeply, and whispered a soft, "Thank you." Not because everything made sense, but because she had finally learned that meaning does not come from escaping suffering, but from walking through it with courage, tenderness, and the kind of faith that turns darkness into a doorway. Thank you for watching this story, and if something in it touched your heart or helped you breathe just a little easier, don't forget to subscribe to Belief Matters. Share this video with someone who needs this message today, and if you believe healing is possible even in suffering, type Amen in the comments.